Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in career development in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Patton McDowell, and in addition to podcasting, I'm a leadership coach, a mastermind facilitator, a best-selling author, and a speaker. I love taking these nonprofit leadership topics on the road or into your Zoom room. If you need someone for your next conference or workshop, check out my new speaking page at pattonmcdowell.com for more information. Well, you're in for another fantastic conversation in this episode with Melisa Galasso, who is the founder and CEO of Galasso Learning Solutions and the author of a great book called Money Matters for Nonprofits: How Board Members Can Harness the Power of Financial Statements by Understanding Basic Accounting. Well, let's face it, many of your board members may not be comfortable in the finance and accounting space, but we need them to be. And quite honestly, you might want to be more comfortable in the finance area as a nonprofit leader as well. Maybe you're like me, you came up through the program or the fundraising side, but know you've got to be more confident in this financial arena. This is definitely the episode that's going to help you. Melisa talks about critical leadership concepts like internal controls, board responsibilities as it relates to finance, and how to better utilize the finance and accounting folks that you may already be utilizing through your nonprofit organization. Lots of reasons to check out the show notes for this episode. It's number 202. Just go to the new podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com and you'll find out all of the resources Melisa and I discuss, as well as more information on the great work she's doing through Galasso Learning Solutions. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Melisa Galasso. Melisa, thank you for joining me on the path.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to talk accounting.
Well, as an English major, accounting may not be the most exciting topic, but you make it exciting, Melisa, and I'm grateful for you joining me on this podcast because I think I represent some listeners out there that, frankly, finance and budget and accounting can be intimidating. And for many nonprofit leaders, they didn't necessarily come through that track. And that's why you have such a wonderful set of resources, including a wonderful book that we will talk about later. But let me ask you that question. You're working with a lot of nonprofits. What do you see as the biggest challenge maybe that nonprofit leaders and their boards are facing as it relates to finances and accounting?
Well, I really see two things out there. One, like many people who didn't come up the accounting and the in the finance path, what I find some people are is they're literally afraid of the numbers. Like they don't want to really know them. They don't want they get overwhelmed by them. And so they tend to think of them as a compliance exercise. We're going to make the budget. I don't really understand the budget. I'm going to make these financials. I don't really understand the financials. And they don't use them as tools. They're really just sort of the enemy in terms of they take a lot of time. I don't really understand them. I'm afraid. I always hear, I'm not a numbers person.
Yes.
We can overcome that, I promise. You don't have to be a numbers person to be a good steward of funding because, again, most nonprofits need funding in order to do their mission and to be successful. And if you're ignoring the numbers, it can lead you down a really, really bad path. So I would say being afraid of the, being afraid of the numbers and not using the information to make good decisions is probably the first one. But then the second one I would say that is somewhat problematic is that they don't leverage the people who can actually help them with understanding the numbers. They, CPAs, in my experience, really love to help boards. They love to help their nonprofit clients. And they would love for people to ask questions. Hey, explain this to me. But what we find in practice is the complete opposite. They're like, we'll just approve those financials and you can leave now because you make me nervous, as opposed to leveraging these amazing humans.
You raised so many good points. And again, I'm guilty, particularly early in my career, where it was easy just to throw that excuse out. Well, I'm not a numbers person, so someone else, I'm sure, will figure it out. And I'm guessing you've seen this too, Melisa. Well, there's that one person on the board that is a, quote, finance person, so I guess I'll assume he or she has it all figured out. But we make a mistake, don't we, of just assuming somebody else has got it all figured out.
Absolutely. One, that's not really true because while the treasurer does have responsibilities for some of the numbers, that person is not the only person responsible for those
Right.
numbers. So you can't kind of get rid of your fiduciary responsibility by simply saying, hey, I'm just going to let you do this. I'm not a numbers person. This is all you. That's really relegating your responsibilities to others, and that's not appropriate. So we have to kind of dig in. We have to go beyond, oh, we have one person on the board who understands this stuff. Everybody on the board should be actively trying to understand and to learn and to ask questions, because you learn by asking questions.
Yeah, that's such a good reminder. And again, we all need to embrace lifelong learning, including in subject areas like this, even if it's not necessarily where we came from. Now, I take it you came from this area, from maybe early stage profession. You've been doing this for what, almost 2 decades now. I guess, how did you get into this field, and what in particular led to the work you're doing in the nonprofit arena?
Absolutely. So yes, I did major in accounting in college, but I will tell you, I didn't go to school to become an accounting major. I applied to the business school because my mom's only requirement in going to college is that I had to be able to pay for myself when I graduated.
Right.
And I was like, well, it looks like those kids in the business school get good jobs afterwards. So I applied to the business school. And the very first class I ever took at Georgetown was a Wednesday morning, which is when they always started classes, and 10:15 in the morning, I took Intro to Accounting. And I fell in love. Like, I had never been exposed to that before. I've never seen it. My family doesn't come from a whole line of accountants.
Right.
But I just, I loved the debits equal the credits, the trial balance balancing. There's something really type A about that.
Right. Right.
And so I majored in accounting. I went on to work in public accounting. I went on to work in industry. And I always came back to this desire to help and teach. I was a teaching assistant in college. I was teaching at night after full days of work. I was teaching CPA review to get the next generation of CPAs to become
Wow.
CPAs. Yep, I love it. I've always had a passion for training. And I ended up working in national office for a firm, and national office is where all the people who are really technical go to make sure that the firm is doing what they need to do. And so my two responsibilities working at the firm were to teach what was changing, what the people out in the field needed to know, and then to review their work. So I didn't have a big client base myself, but I worked with all the different clients, reviewing the work papers, making sure the audits were done well. But really interacting with all of the staff who were out in the field. And one of my passions had always been nonprofit and government. I taught it for CPA review for a number of years. And I will tell you, not too many of us out there who love nonprofit and government as our primary.
Right. Right.
And so when I was hired, they're like, you can have that. And so I became the nonprofit and government technical lead. And I took over the internal workings for the firm. And I just loved the training so much. And it couldn't possibly be the full-time job that it wanted to. So then I created Galasso Learning Solutions so that I could teach full-time and help improve the financial reporting for governments and nonprofits all over the country.
It's fantastic. And you started, I guess, to answer my next question, which is talk about your practice. And again, I'm guessing many of our listeners have a general sense of what an accountant might do to help their nonprofit, but maybe you could expand upon literally the services you offer.
Absolutely. So, when you're working in public accounting, you might be doing audits for your clients. You might be doing reviews. You might be doing compilations. You could be doing bookkeeping services. So different nonprofits need different services from their CPA. And I work with those CPA firms to keep their people on top of what's changing, what they need to know from both an accounting perspective, but also an auditing perspective, because they're out in the field. They're making a huge difference for their clients. They are out there having the conversations, but they are so busy doing that they don't have time to research. They don't have time to be listening to the FASB meetings. They don't have time for, what's happening in between. And so I really think of it as my responsibility to be out there, being part of what's going on. I'm on the FASB's Not-for-Profit Advisory Committee, or the FASB is the Financial Accounting Standards Board. They are the people who write GAAP for nonprofits and other commercial entities.
Right.
And I take all that information and I distill it down in a really practical, engaging environment. And I train them on how to make things happen for their nonprofit clients. And it's just a wonderful experience for me. It takes all the things I love, the technical, the training, the interaction, and lets me really help the nonprofit sector in a big way.
Well, and I was going to say, it's led to expertise that is not just within individual organizations, but you're seeing the sector as a whole. I guess you're seeing the trends, the issues, right, that affect all nonprofits, I guess, large and small.
Absolutely. I have clients across the country. I actually have a couple of nonprofit conferences globally this year that I'll get to go to be able. I'm going to Copenhagen later this summer for a nonprofit that's having their all hands meeting there and really getting to talk to people literally around the globe about what's going on in the nonprofit accounting world. So it is phenomenal. The challenges, I will have to tell you, sound a lot the same. Like, where you're
no
going.
matter where you are, you still see.
Is saying.
Yeah. Well,
oh, yeah.
And I guess so these organizations can kind of scale up or down, literally the services you provide, or do you find it is a steady stream of accounting services on year-long or multi-year-long basis?
Yeah, I work with a lot of clients over time. There are sometimes years where there's more change than others. We just went through several rounds of changes for not-for-profits in particular with new grant guidance and new accounting for grants. Obviously, with all of the federal funding that rolled out, there was a lot of complications with accounting. So there are years where you need more of me. And then there are years where you need a little bit less. But like this year, one of the big topics for those who do follow GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, we're implementing the lease standard for a lot of clients right now. And so that's a hot topic for nonprofits of all sizes that do use GAAP financials.
Well, and speaking of the resources that we want our nonprofit leaders to find out about, you've written a fantastic book called Money Matters for Nonprofits. Talk about the book. Why'd you write it? What is your objective, in addition, I guess, to just educating folks like me who need to learn more about these money matters?
Well, prior to COVID, I spent a lot of time on the road. I travel all over the country serving CPA firms coast to coast. And during COVID, I didn't have to travel quite so much. I didn't have my airplanes. I didn't have my layovers, and I had a little bit of free time. And when I think about how I support nonprofits and how I support CPA firms, a lot of times it is the education, but one of the things that I hear pretty frequently are also what's not working. And some of my CPA firm clients would be like, hey, we spend all this time, we do this audit, we give them this report, and then the board just votes to approve it. And they don't really understand it. They don't ask any questions. And it's really frustrating. Do you have any suggestion for resources on nonprofit accounting? And there are some phenomenal books out there related to governance for boards. There's a lot of really good how to do like QuickBooks level items, but most board members don't need that level of detail, right? They don't need to be in the weeds. They need to be able to read the financials. They need to be able to ask the right questions. And I couldn't really put my hand on a book that did that was at the level where it kind of talks about, yeah, this is the governance, but a small piece of it. And here's the accounting without getting too into the weeds. And so I kind of felt like that free time should be devoted to writing a book that kind of solved that problem. It was definitely a COVID passion project that I wanted to help support my clients with. And my clients were phenomenal. I did multiple surveys and asked them, like, what are some of the issues that you're seeing, or what are some questions you wish that people would provide or would ask? And I literally included them in the book. So like there's an entire appendix on questions to ask your auditor. And I have to thank many, many clients who responded to my survey that were like, this is what we want them to ask. And so that's literally how, it came to be. And my goal was really to help those in the board position, but also others. I've heard people who work in other departments within a nonprofit say, oh my God, I finally understand my P&L because I've always gotten this report, but I really didn't know what it meant. And now I've read it. And while they weren't like the explicit target audience, they're still getting a lot of positive feedback because again, they don't need to do the debits and credits. They just need to be able to read the financials.
So just to be clear, is it in some ways, if I'm a nonprofit leader listening, this is something I should give my board members almost as part of their orientation to nonprofit board governance, or I'm sure it would help me as a staff member as well.
Oh, yes. I mean, it is definitely written for people who need to understand the concepts and the theories in a very practical way. Lots of stories, a lot of application. We do a lot of little case studies to, turn it into more of a layman's terminology. It's probably not the book for the CPA to be learning how to do it, because we
Right,
don't go into
right.
like the journal entry. But anyone who works in a nonprofit who needs to be responsible for their either profit segment or their operating segment, and they want to understand where these numbers are coming from, definitely would benefit. But the board is a huge portion of that, and really trying to help the board do their fiduciary responsibilities.
Well, we work with individuals in our mastermind program, and we talk about some of the key skills and experience necessary for effective nonprofit leadership. Financial acumen is often one of the top items on many nonprofit leaders' list of things I need to work on. And so, again, this is exactly the kind of resource they need if they want to improve. And again, I was grateful, Melissa, in talking about this episode. You and I talked about, all right, what are some practical things we could discuss that would help a listener right now? And you came up with 3 of them. So I'm always I'm a rule of 3 kind of guy anyway. So let's talk about, in addition to the book, let's underline that as a resource for our listeners, especially those who want to improve their financial acumen. But number 1 on your list was internal controls. So what do you mean by that, and what could a listener take away that might help them right away?
So internal controls are really important, because that's how you prevent as well as detect and correct errors as well as fraud. And if you really haven't had an opportunity to sort of think about your systems, things like segregation of duties, right? How do I ensure that the person who's receiving the funds isn't the person also depositing fund, and the one who's entering the funds, and the one reconciling the bank account? Because obviously that can lead to a lot of the ability changes that may not be correct. And while nobody wants to think that someone in their organization is committing fraud, it is often what we call, the person that you least expect is the person who's actually committing the fraud, because we have this sort of general, wanting to look for the best in people.
Right.
And so when we think about internal controls, they're a way to prevent by separating those duties that are not appropriate. And then also to, if you can't always get preventative controls, that you're detecting, that you're reconciling the bank statement, you're reconciling the balance sheet in order to identify where there were errors or where there's something was missed, so that you can correct it. And so those internal controls can be really valuable, and included in that sort of, how can I do a due diligence concept? It's really your ability to evaluate yourself. And so when I think about it from the nonprofit's perspective, and in particular the board, what are they doing to evaluate the organization? What are they doing to ensure that there's not a trend that they're missing that's going to lead to failure later? Or if they're doing that internal control, maybe you don't have segregation of duties. Maybe there isn't, it's a small nonprofit. There are lots of really small nonprofits out there that just don't have those resources. Maybe the board should be approving check requests, and maybe the board should be reviewing the reconciliations, right? The board can step up for those organizations that don't have that size. And so we need to think about, well, how can we really leverage, the board in part of the internal controls, but also in evaluating the organization. So, I always like to talk about trend analysis. I love to talk about ratio analysis,
Right.
because when we think about ratios, they tell a story. So if you're not a numbers person, you might be a story person, right?
Exactly.
So if you can take those numbers and say, okay, I'm going to look at liquidity ratios, and I'm going to try to figure out whether I have sufficient funds, and I do a couple of numbers and I do them consistently, and I'm looking at them over a number of years, I can start seeing, look, we just don't have enough cash to pay our bills coming up, right? I can see that coming. I can be proactive about it. I can look at things like spending ratios. Where's our funding going? And I can tell a story about it. I can look at efficiency ratios to say, okay, I'm spending this money on fundraising. but what kind of return am I getting on this
Yes.
fundraising?
Yes.
Like there's stories that can be told by the board when they try to leverage the information here, and they don't just kind of sit back and they say, okay, the numbers are the numbers, but the numbers should be telling a story, and the board has a responsibility to understand that story and compare it to what the story you're hearing from management. If management's telling a story that things are looking good and you're seeing that you have no cash, maybe we need to have a conversation to understand why there's these disconnects between the stories you're hearing and what the story you're reading when you look at those financials.
I'm so glad you bring that kind of story framework up, because you're right. I think too many, and I know you're going to get to this in our second topic area, how we present these numbers as nonprofit leaders is critical. And if we aren't telling stories, I think, and this is my unscientific opinion, but 90% of the board, their eyes glaze over and they're like, oh, I'm not going to even take the time to try to interpret these numbers. But if we presented them in story fashion, I wonder if that would just improve, the understanding across the board. But before we go there, Melisa, can I return to this top, internal control topic? What type of fraud do you see most often? Are there examples? Because again, I think most of us are like, hey, we're a nonprofit. Everybody here is well-intentioned. They're good people. Surely fraud wouldn't happen here. But I'm guessing you've seen every variation of it. Are there some kind of key examples of fraud that sadly you've seen occur?
Yeah, there's actually a book. It was one of the resources I thought about in preparing for today's session, and it's called Embezzlement: How to Detect, Prevent, and Investigate Pink Collar Crime. We tend to like to talk about white collar crime because that's kind of ooh and wow, and it's flashy.
Right.
But what we find in pink collar crime, it's typically perpetuated by someone with very limited power. White collar crime, it's the CFO, it's the CEO, and they're stealing billions of dollars. And like, wow, I want to talk about that. But what I actually agree with, the author Kelly Paxton does a really good job of talking about, it's often the office manager, it's the bookkeeper, it's not the people who commit the white collar crimes and nonprofits in particular, because there's that lack of segregation of duties. There's that trust factor, right? No one thinks that the church secretary is stealing money, right?
Yep.
But they've got the access, there isn't any internal control, and there's this total trust that's happening. And so when we look at the fraud triangle, what we often find in nonprofits in particular is way too much trust, so much opportunity because there's a failure to really implement those internal controls, and literally the whole thing caves in. And so it's the small dollars over a long period of time that really do most nonprofits in.
But it's usually, isn't it, because one person is managing some sort of financial process from start to finish, therefore no one else is even seeing it?
Absolutely, right? They're getting the money in. The office manager, right, grabs the money. They deposit the money or a portion of the money. They get the bank statement. They verify it, right? It goes to accounting only after the fact. And then when the stories are being told, right, no one's really following up on, oh, so-and-so said they were going to donate. Oh, I guess they changed their mind, right? And so there's no checks that come into play because they literally have no segregation of duties.
Yeah, well put. And thank you for that explanation. And again, it's a sad reality, but we all, as stewards of the funds that come through our nonprofit, we need to have these internal controls, as you articulated so well. And I guess related is the board's responsibilities. I know that's category number 2, I guess, for us, Melisa. Talk about that in particular and how the board needs to play a part in what you're just describing.
Absolutely. So if you have a fiduciary board, you actually have a legal responsibility as a board member. And I so wish when people signed up to be on the board, I love picking people who have a passion for the mission. I love picking people who love to fundraise, but I wish we would say, and by the way, you're now legally responsible for this organization, because I think it's like missed in board training. They're like, hey, I have a passion. I want to help out. I want to call a whole bunch of people. And you're like, well, actually, the American Bar Association has this lovely committee that writes a model act, and many states actually enforce it, which grants all of the powers of a nonprofit to a board of directors. In fact, a nonprofit corporation must have a board of directors. So you have just signed up for legal responsibility because all corporate power falls to the board. Yes. So you big responsibility. It's not just fundraising. It's not just being out there and that day-to-day activity. You have a duty of care. You have a responsibility for participating in meetings, making sure that the entity is, and compliant with laws and regulations. You have to make sure that you're staying up to date on when you're voting. You have to make sure policies are correct. You have a duty of loyalty, which when you get into all those conflict of interest policies, no one ever wants to talk about because Joe would never take advantage of us. Well, that's why we have duty of loyalty requirements.
Exactly.
And we have duty of obedience, right? So when we're doing this, we really need to follow the laws. We need to know what those laws are, right? I've had a couple of times where they said, you know what, I took over as treasurer and I found out we haven't filed our 990, which is the equivalent of an informational tax return,
Right.
in years. And we are really close to no longer being a nonprofit in the eyes of the IRS because nobody took the time to understand the regulations of the nonprofit.
Oh my goodness. And I'm nodding in agreement with everything you said. And I think, though, I have been guilty, and I wonder if some listening would say, Melissa, yeah, we don't want to scare off good board members. So you're right. We appeal to their programmatic, their mission-based enthusiasm. But your point is a careful reminder, especially in a fiduciary board, not just an advisory board, but fiduciary. It is absolutely paramount. We go into these level of, I guess, governance responsibilities at the outset.
Absolutely. And again, there's a lot that goes back to management, right? Selecting the right executive director, ensuring that you give them the right policy so they can do the day-to-day. Because no one's asking you to micromanage, right? That's not what the board is supposed to be doing. They're not supposed to be in the day-to-day. They're supposed to be really helping the organization be properly staffed, that they have with the resources that they need. And then they're providing the oversight function. And so very often what we need to make sure we're doing is really not skipping that oversight role, right? We want to have great management. We want to have, someone with a finance background, whether they're a CFO or a finance director of some sort. But we want to make sure that the board is doing those oversight because it is going to be one of those things where it comes back and the board is looked on very poorly when the taxes aren't filed, when there's no risk management strategy, there are no internal controls, there's been no, key performance indicators, there's no strategic planning. That's all really part of the board.
Absolutely. And, something I've seen, Melissa, and I wonder if you would agree that I don't think we in the sector often do a good job in terms of the board orientation and then the reporting. As you said earlier, we lack storytelling around the numbers. And so there's not clarity when I first joined the board as to how, I guess, the financial model of our nonprofit works and the effective reporting that goes on at subsequent board meetings. But are there characteristics you've seen of organizations that really do a good job in orientation? Now, how much detail do they need to start? And then maybe a related question is, effective reporting at board meetings for our board members. So are there kind of some highlights there you might share?
Absolutely. So first off, the budget is not a once a year activity where we make a budget and we never look at it again until we make next year's budget. So
Exactly.
we're gonna spend all this time making a budget. We might as well use it effectively. And so we should see budget to actuals at every meeting. So when someone joins the board, the first thing we should do is talk about, okay, how do we generate revenue? What are the sources? Do we have exchange revenue? Do we sell things? Do we have programmatic type of revenue? Do we have mostly donations? Are those cash donations from individuals? Are they grants? Who else is funding us? Where do these come from and what percentages? Do we have investments that are generating income? And really, first off, where does our money come from? Because if you don't know where the money is coming from, you don't know how it's doing comparatively. So the first thing you need to start with your board training is this is all of our revenue sources and this is how we budget for revenue, right? And so that's the starting point. And then just like anything else, a nonprofit is very much run like a business. It has salaries expense, it has rent expense, it has utilities, right? It has to have these costs in order to be able to thrive as a business. So then we look at, okay, well, what are our major costs? Where are they? What are the levers that lead them to incurring more or less, right? So if I serve more people, yes, I have more cost associated with serving those people, right? So you have to understand how those levers work. Are these fixed costs? Or are these variable? And then how do we come up with our budget? And I always remind people that hope is not a strategy. We don't
Yeah.
hope the budget happens. We
Sad, but
plan.
true. Yeah.
So true. I've heard people say, well, let's just put our best case scenario down and see if it happens. I'm like, that is not
Maybe
really how
not.
it works. So starting with that, and then at every board meeting, or at least quarterly, we should have a budget to actual. What did we actually do compared to budget? Are we on track? Why are we not on track? There should be an explanation, and that doesn't have to come from the board. That should come from management.
Yeah.
Management should be
Right.
saying, hey, this is where we're missing. Hey, this revenue is not coming in, or we didn't get the grant that we expected, or we served less people, so therefore we didn't get as much money. And so we have to really make sure that we understand, okay, how are we doing compared to budget? And then I believe that every board should pick a set of key performance indicators, or what we call KPIs. And
Right.
these KPIs can be super helpful for organizations because they can change, right? If we know we want to go in a certain direction, we can come up with leading and lagging indicators that tell us whether we're going in that direction. And we should look at them. So I've served on a couple of boards that have done a really great job, right? They had red, yellow, green, right? Where we want to be, green, we're kind of heading in that direction, or red, let's talk about this at this meeting, right? Let's have
Yes.
that conversation. It can be very visual. You don't have to like numbers to use numbers, right?
You
So
illustrate the story, right? Your
yes,
colors illustrate literally the story that you're trying to tell.
exactly. And most people can read us, red, yellow, green is something that's pretty,
Familiar.
obvious. Let's look at those red ones and figure it out. And I don't recommend using the same ones, because as you change as an organization, right, you're looking for different goals. And so you need to track different things. And so the board can kind of strategically decide what are those KPIs for the current year, and then which ones are we going to do next year as we get closer to that goal, or as we maybe try to expand, what is it that we need to look at? And so this way the board comes with an expectation of, one, having pre-read their homework before they
Indeed.
get there.
Indeed.
And then two, they can ask the questions, right? So they're going to say, hey, I noticed this is red, why? Or I noticed that our revenue is significantly below in this area, like why? Let's have that conversation. And so if we come prepared, we can do great things for the organization.
It's a fantastic checklist, Melissa, both of the orientation process, the level of detail that you need to get into with your board. I love the KPI structure, because that would then bring everyone together in terms of what we all need to understand and follow. And I guess in board meetings, Melissa, do you like narrative cover pages, if you will? I see a lot of times just pages and pages of numeric reporting. And is that effective? But at least, I guess maybe this is me, the English major, looking for the narrative content. But what do you think? Is that a good idea?
You actually are not alone. There was a project that the FASB had looked at a couple of years ago. It ultimately did not go down this path, but they had looked at what governments are required to do. And governmental entities are required to provide what they call management discussion and analysis, or MDNA.
Okay.
And they're required to summarize in words and pictures and charts the financials, because most people can't read a government financial, but they can read pretty pictures, they can read the charts, they can see the graphs, and they get a better understanding. And so governmental accounting is written by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, or GASB, and they
Okay.
require MDNA. And so some years ago, back before ASU 2016-14 came out, FASB actually floated the idea of requiring MDNA for nonprofits, because of that exact reason, that nonprofit boards couldn't necessarily get into the details unless we turned it into a narrative, unless we provide it in pictorial form.
Right.
Ultimately, they decided not to mandate it, simply because it was not really within their purview. They have a financial reporting purview. That's not really their responsibility, but it's still seen as a best practice. So making your numbers talk, right? Making them, very visual, turning them into trend analysis is something that is highly recommended, and giving those explanations, those words. So you don't have to just have all these numbers. You can have a story that accompanies them. And it also helps because you can now talk to donors, right? So just think about this.
Yes.
Not only do you have staff who understand their numbers because they have to research and explain it, you have boards who can go out and say, hey, we didn't get 3 grants and we're really trending down in this contribution area. We need to make up for it with individual funding, right? You can now have a conversation that's really talking to the donor about where your organization is.
Yeah, love that. Again, as you said earlier, the power of the story, particularly our understanding of that story, then becomes a tool we can use in the community and have these conversations. And of course, the KPIs and the visual scorecard, as you described it, I guess then could be enhanced with narrative explanation. And then we all are going to be 3 steps ahead instead of half your board not even being clear on what's going on.
Yeah, they've lost attention, they've zoned out, and they just really want this to
Exactly.
be over.
Right.
They just want you to leave as the CPA. If you could just leave now, I would be grateful, right? That's
Gosh,
not engagement.
we have not welcomed you into our boardrooms, Melissa, like we should, right? And that's a shame because again, you're helping us, not just some kind of on the side accounting function. This is fundamental to our strategy, and it leads perfectly, I think, to the third headline you offer, which is too many of us in the nonprofit sector are not taking advantage of our accounting talent, I guess, both on staff, I guess, and outside counsel like you. But talk about that. What do you mean, and how can we better utilize the kind of expertise you bring?
Absolutely. So internally, you likely have someone who's responsible for bookkeeping, or you might even outsource that bookkeeping function, which is totally fine. But that person should be giving you these numbers. It's not the board's responsibility to pull together a deck related to finance, right? Somebody should be providing these budget to actuals with explanations, right? And not just like high level, but really like true root cause analysis, like, and layman's terms. Like I can absolutely douse you all day in jargon, but I don't think that helps
That
anyone.
doesn't help. Yeah, right.
So like make this as easy as possible. I always say, talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old. Like, what do I need to know here? And that's not in a pejorative way. It's just in a, let's all make sure we are all on the same page and we all come with different, responsibilities, because we need everyone on the board. We need the marketing people. We need the people with business development. We need everyone in their background, but we also need to make sure we're all on the same page. So we need those explanations to be really friendly. We also need to leverage them for trend analysis, because a year is just a year, right? We don't know, revenue is $1 million. Is that good? Well, I don't know. How much was it last year? What was your budget, right?
Right,
So a number
right.
is a number without any context. So trend analysis, how have we been trending in these areas? What are it could even be quarterly trends if there's seasonality. We get a lot of our funding at this point from grants. We got a lot of year-end funding, which is halfway through our fiscal year. And so what is our trends? What are we expecting here? And then again, those KPIs should also be coming from management. So really leveraging the internal elements. But as you said, you have an external team and they would love to help. I can't tell you how frustrated they are when you don't ask any questions. They go and they present the financials, they present their audit report, and they're like, any questions? And everyone says no. And they say, okay, let's vote to get these people out of here. It's
Yeah,
basically
right.
they are there for benchmarking. They literally audit probably 100 other nonprofits your size. Like, ask them, how are we doing compared to all your
Compared to
other?
others. Yeah.
They can tell a story.
Again, such a good reminder. And yes, I have seen exactly that scenario you described, where we're just trying to check it off the list on the agenda, and instead of using this as an opportunity to really strategically advance the organization, given the expertise they have. And let's be blunt, I guess, Melissa, these folks, they're not going to charge you more, right? And they
No,
want to offer some follow-up, some feedback, some discussion. But I wonder again if we're just not taking advantage of that, and that's at our own detriment.
absolutely. I mean, there are required communications that they have to do. So they often put them in writing because it's required, but they would love to talk about it, right? They're required to tell you if you have internal control deficiencies that are significant, or their material weaknesses. Like, they have to tell you that. They want to tell you about where you could improve your internal controls. They also want to talk about, well, what's coming down the pike? What are some changes that you might have to implement? What are some standards that you might have to do? If you're willing to let them have that conversation with you. They are there with a lot of experience. They do a lot of training. CPAs have to get 40 hours a year of continuing education. That's more than doctors or lawyers.
Wow.
Like, they're smart people. Let them help you. Let them be a support system. They can't charge extra for your board meeting, right? They're there to help. And we think about this from an independence perspective. They literally say that answering questions and providing advice is part of the audit, right? That is part of the work. And even if you're not getting an audit, maybe you're getting a lower level service, which is all you need right now.
Yeah.
That person still should have a lot of industry experience and be able to share that with you.
Great advice and encouragement, frankly, to those that maybe are just not as comfortable in the finance and accounting arena. In fact, that's my final question for you, Melissa. This has been a masterclass in some of these concepts, particularly for those nonprofit leaders who aren't as comfortable. But in addition to reading your book, which they should, Is there other advice you'd offer to someone who says, Melissa, I love nonprofit leadership, but gosh, the finance stuff scares me. Or I just am not sure I can handle that. What kind of advice might you offer someone like that?
So if you want to do a great job and you're really involved in the organization, one thing that I think you can always do is have these, like I call them coffee chats. And you kind of just sit down and you can talk about a particular area of the financial statements. You don't have to make it super scary. You can just say, okay, I really just want to understand X part. And either that you're asking the person who's creating them, you're asking the CPA, but you're just sitting down and you're like, I just want to understand a small piece of the puzzle. Because if you learn things in small chunks, one, you have better retention, and two, it's a lot less overwhelming. So don't try to say, oh, I'm going to become an expert. I'm going to read and I'm going to just know everything. But little coffee chats, little taking, of it, understanding of different pieces until you really build up your repertoire, because, you're not going to become an expert overnight, but you can learn a lot in these small little sessions that can help you really take those financial statements and understand them, right? You might say, I'm going to want to understand the first 3 line items of this, financial statement. And then I want to learn the next 3 until I have a good understanding. And then I'm like, oh, I am actually conversant. I can tell you about my financials.
Yeah, it's such good advice. I was fortunate when I worked, Melissa, for Special Olympics North Carolina as a rookie, and I had a CFO that she was very gracious to me, and she said something very similar. It's like, hey, Patton, let's just talk about the top 3 revenue drivers for this organization are A, B, and C, and here's what you need to look for in the financial reports. And here are the 3 key expense items for this organization. Here's what you need to look for. But it sounds like that would be what you're suggesting. Almost sit down for coffee and don't, bury yourself in too many lines, but maybe just start with a few.
Yeah, definitely. You don't need to go in all in. And what are the most important? Which are the ones that have the biggest levers? Which are the ones can you control, right? You probably can't
Yes.
control rent. Rent's probably locked in for some time,
Yes.
but we
Right.
can control other things when we can have that influence. And so try to understand the ones that you can actually influence the most.
Yep. Again, great advice as you have provided throughout this conversation. And for that, I'm grateful. I do have a parting gift, if I might. Of course, we're going to lift up your book, and you and I've talked about several books that have been meaningful for you. Might there be one other recommendation you would have for our listeners?
I definitely am a big fan of Eric Hamburg's The Little Book of Boards. It's probably one of my favorite because it is probably one of the easiest to read books. And if you're now maybe a little nervous about your fiduciary responsibility because you didn't
Right.
actually know what you signed up for, and you're like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore, I want to convince you that you actually do want to keep going and you still want to very much be on a board, and you want to, if you're a nonprofit leader, be on other boards because you learned what other people are doing well and what you can bring back. And so I find it a very easy to read book, very concise, that really talks about, okay, what is it that I am signing up for? What is it? And it's not too much. If you're new to this is something that I think is a really handy area for people to get a better understanding of for nonprofits. And it's not written for big, gigantic nonprofits who have like the most professional board you've ever read, right? It's
Right.
really, it's aimed at people who really need the support that in that area.
That is fantastic. I'm delighted to lift up Eric's book. In fact, he's someone I want to get on this podcast because I think you're right. He has a great perspective on the board role, and I'm delighted to lift up his book as one that our listeners should consider. All right, Melissa, thank you again. Where can people find out more about you and the great work you're doing?
All right. Well, I'd give 2 websites. GalassoLearningSolutions.com is our training. You can find out about some of the topics that we offer. We also do a blog every week on what's changing in accounting. So if you want to not be necessarily surprised, that can be a great option. And then also our Money Matters for Nonprofits.com book, our website, which has a little bit more about some of the services we offer for boards, including some board retreats and things of that nature, if they want to really dive into those. And then LinkedIn is obviously one of the best places to find me. We're really active. I have an amazing social media team that really helps make sure that we're getting the information out that's needed to support accounting professionals and nonprofit organizations. So those would be the 3 best ways to find out more.
Fantastic. We will absolutely link up all of these resources and your suggestions in the show notes. Lots of reasons to check out the show notes in this episode. And Melissa, thank you again for joining me on the path.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Melisa as much as I did and came away with new confidence as it relates to financial acumen in the nonprofit space. And hopefully you can apply some of these principles to your board of directors as well. Don't forget about the show notes. They are available on our website, pattonmcdowell.com. This is episode number 202, where you can find out more about Melisa, the work she does through Galasso Learning Solutions, and how you can get a copy of her great book, Money Matters for Nonprofits. As always, please share this episode with someone else on the path. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe. Just go to the podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com and you will see the follow button. And if you click on that, you will not miss out on any of our weekly episodes. They come out every Thursday. Of course, if you like this episode, click on the episodes button on the top of that same page, and you can scroll through thumbnails of some of our most popular episodes or search by topic or guest name. Thanks, as always, for what you're doing in the nonprofit sector, especially right now, and keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I'll keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week. I'll see you next time on The Path.